And I'm going to introduce the person who's going to introduce our next speaker. I mentioned Shannon before. Shannon's one of our steering committee members. Big thanks to her. She's been such a fun person to work with on this project. And she's also the connector between our next speaker. So I'm going to ask her to do the honors of introducing.
Okay, I'm just thrilled to introduce Nancy Roach to you all. She's the keynote speaker today. I think I met Nancy in 2005, maybe. It was at either AACR or, where was that? ASCO? It was at ASCO. So Nancy, in 2005, was leading an advocacy training program way back then, and it was my first introduction to advocacy. And honestly, I think it was 2 days at ASCO. And I learned more at that training than I've learned since then. She is the founder of Fight Colorectal Cancer.org and the chairman of the board. And she has an advocacy training program called RATS through that program, which I'm sure you'll talk about, Nancy. But she is just an advocate extraordinaire, an amazing person, just really changed a lot of our lives. So I'm just grateful to have you, Nancy.
Thanks. So, oh geez, is it up? Okay. First of all, technology and I sometimes go along, sometimes don't go along. Second of all, I drove up from Oregon this morning, and on the way up, I was talking to myself through the presentation, and I realized that I was saying something in a way I didn't want to say it, so I got to the hotel and immediately changed it. So I have my notes so that hopefully if I go sideways, it'll bring me back. And third, my husband, thank you for inviting me. My family is just blown away. I have 2 adult children and a husband, and they're like, they invited you for a keynote? 45 minutes? So I'm like, well, yes, actually, in my own life, I am. So thank you all. You gave us a great dinner table conversation. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is research advocacy. And the reason I asked about patient, advocate, stakeholder is because in the community I'm in, which is primarily oncology, but I also do a lot of all disease patient advocacy work, we're developing fairly specific terminology to define the role of people sitting at research tables. So here's my disclosure. One of the things we teach our advocates is that you always disclose potential financial conflicts of interest. We take money from everyone, and you can donate at our website. But more importantly, I know I say that at research meetings, and the doctors never laugh, which just cracks me up. So more importantly, here's some of the things I've done in my life. With NCI, I've been involved with NCI and cooperative groups, different kinds of academic research organizations in multiple different ways. I've been involved with FDA and their patient rep program. I actually sat on the Oncology Drug Advisory Committee for one meeting, which was the most intimidating thing I've ever done in my life. There are like 30 of them and one of me, and we're mic'd up. And it was pretty scary. And I'm involved with a FDA Duke public-private partnership called this Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. So I've done a lot of different kinds of patient advocacy, and today what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of historical perspective, because I'm old enough that I have always looked at what has happened in the past before I start to change things for the future, and then kind of where things are today, and then a little bit of blue sky over what I think is going to happen in the future. And honestly, okay, I'm going to be political. If Trump gets elected, I'm leaving. This is it. So here's the past. When I've looked, so Franklin Roosevelt is one of my all-time heroes. I just have adored him since I was a kid, and I read one of his biographies. He actually founded the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which morphed into the March of Dimes. And this was an example, one of the first examples of a patient forming an organization to help other patients. And so when I started looking this up, it's like the original patient advocate was Franklin Roosevelt, which I thought was really cool. When I looked into those models, the model that he used and others, I found that primarily what they were doing was supporting research by raising money. So March of Dimes, people mailed in dimes. And it helps, by the way, if you're president when you launch something like this. Here's some other people who use their platforms to make some profound changes in health advocacy and how research was funded. So there's Jerry Lewis. How many of you remember the telethons? Right, okay. That's from one of the early ones. Then the Jimmy Fund was put together by Sidney Farber, that Farber, as in Dana Farber, to fund his childhood leukemia research. And the Stamp is another one of my heroes. That's Mary Lasker. And she was a great woman. She took over the American Cancer Society in the late 40s. And it was kind of a gentleman's club of physicians mostly. And she said, hey, we got to fund research. And so she changed the direction of the American Cancer Society in the 40s, which was a woman I think that was probably hard for her. She also is the one who got Nixon to sign into law the National Cancer Institute. And she's had a profound impact. I don't think anyone would say that NCI is a patient advocacy organization, but it funds research. So these people have all had a huge impact on the funding of research. Impact on the conduct of research took something else. So I don't know how many of you remember in the 80s when gay-related autoimmune disease first started cropping up. I lived in LA. I worked with a guy whose partner was one of the first dozen people to die at UCLA from this. And for those of us, today it seems amazing what the world was like then. So the responses of, well, that's their disease. We don't have to worry about it. There was a huge stigma around it. There was fear of contagion. There was the lack of research funding and the very slow progress of research at that time. And the fact that nobody even wanted to talk about it. So what they did is, I was very impressed. They organized, right? So they organized for awareness and to get the word out that it wasn't their disease, it was our disease. And so you see in that picture, you see gay men, but you see moms and dads and siblings and friends too. They also organized not just for awareness, but also to make policy changes and force payers to compensate for, to cover access to care. They pushed FDA and got an approval mechanism that would speed approval. And they managed to, oh, there was one thing. I'm going to remember this in 5 minutes and go, oh, they did this. But this is what I loved. They stormed the NIH, right? They organized a walk-in to NIH, and they said, not only are we going to get you more funding, but we want to be involved in the development of the research agendas, the development of specific protocols. We aren't passive in this. We are part of this. And their involvement had a profound impact. I mean, when I talk to HIV researchers, they look at cancer researchers and think that they're in the dark ages because the HIV community has lived this for 25, 30 years. And they've had a profound impact, and they educate. So here's why they worked. They educated themselves. They came to the table as colleagues, not as patients, but as colleagues. And I'm saying that because this is something I hear a lot from researchers is, if you're a patient, you're one thing. If you're a colleague, you're a different thing. And so that's one of those language things that's really interesting to me. And they are highly educated. So when I found out about this, I talked to a friend who was an HIV advocate, and I said, I want to have 20 people like that. And this was in 1999. He said, it takes longer than you think. And he was right. He still reminds me of that. And this was the quilt on the mall. And it just shows the power. I've seen bits and pieces of it in museums, and it shows around the country. And it just shows the power of what can happen when people join together for a common cause. And that went out into other disease areas and other body parts. So this is Bill Clinton signing in the Defeat Breast Cancer law in 1993. And breast cancer, I think, is the most visible organization to take this on. But there are tons of groups that started popping up in the 90s. And I'm going to tell you a story. It's one of my favorite stories, and I've heard it from several different people, and I think it's mostly true. But, you know, breast cancer, NBCC, they said, you know, if we had $10 million, we could cure breast cancer. And I said, how did you pick 10 million? We just kind of made it up. I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, this is a story being told to me in 2000. This all happened in the early 90s. And so they went to NIH and NCI and said, we're going to get you $10 million for breast cancer research. We want a seat at the table to define how it's going to be spent. And NCI said, oh, we'll take the money, but, you know, we know how to spend it best. So the breast cancer advocates went to the Department of Defense, which also has a medical research program, and said, we're going to get you $10 million to do breast cancer research, and we want to be at the table. And DOD said, great, y'all come. So DOD now has a very large peer-reviewed medical research program that includes a lot of different cancers, many other diseases. I sit on one panel for them, and the process is fundamentally different from an NIH process. I mean, there's like equal numbers of advocates and researchers, and our voices, it's not a fight to get your voice heard. Granted, they pick advocates pretty carefully. You want people who can actually contribute to those discussions, but it's very different. But what's happened then in like the last, since the mid-90s to about now, is there have been so many advocacy groups that have popped up, and they all do different things. Some fund research, some do research, some do support, some do awareness. And so it's very confusing. So I'm not surprised that if a researcher says, yeah, I know we're all wicked smart, right? If a researcher goes, well, I need to do patient engagement, and then goes, I don't even know where to start, because if you're not hooked into those networks, you literally, I mean, I get the strangest phone calls because people refer me around, use my name a lot, and I've gotten many, many phone calls from people saying, you know, I really want to involve patients in research and I don't know where to start. And so we walk through the discussion. So that's kind of where we are today. And the landscape has evolved. Patient engagement is there. It's not always widely funded, but it's widely supported. The internet and social media have allowed us to engage in ways we never could have before. I mean, I don't know how advocates could be advocates without access to the internet, because I'm constantly looking up articles, scholarly articles, to understand what I'm seeing and all of that. And every disease is a rare disease, which means that every rare disease has its own patient population and its own advocacy group, or maybe multiple advocacy groups, which is even more confusing for the researcher population. So about 8 years ago, the National Cancer Institute put together a working group that said we need to define the role of advocates in research. And one of the things that we did, that was one of those working groups that had, 50 people on it, from talk about stakeholders. We had every stakeholder in the world on it. And it was led by an amazing woman who had a background in HR. And she said, aha, I know what the problem is. We don't have a job title. So we said, okay, research advocates. And I'm going to kind of go in reverse order here. I wear a lot of different hats. When I'm acting as a research advocate, I'm not doing any of that stuff, right? I'm not doing fundraising, hosting a booth, going to a patient conference, anything like that. And I'm not using my personal story to promote change. And that's a big difference between a lot of advocates and research advocates. So this is what research advocates, what it is. And so it's basically, you bring the lay perspective, and the most critical part, and it's interesting how often this has come up, you bring a collective patient experience and perspective. And so I represent colorectal cancer patients frequently. The average age of a newly diagnosed patient in the US is in the early 60s, so I'm there. I started doing this 15 years ago, so I was way too young. More of them are men than are women, so I've had to learn about that. There are people who have stage 1, stage 4, metastatic disease. I don't look like any of that, right? So how do I bring that collective patient experience? But naming it, I think, was really important, because what we were hearing from the researcher side is that when all we represented was our own story, it made it harder for them to take us seriously as representing a patient perspective. So this was the definition. And so how do we engage? And this working group came up with these 4 areas of engagement. We engage in the design of activities, in advisory committees. And this is a profoundly powerful place for advocates if the right people are at the table. Review committees, grant review, project review, manuscript review, which is something I've learned about in the last 10 years. And then in dissemination, how do we get the word out about projects? And it's remarkable to me how parallel a lot of what I'm saying was laid out in the PCORI presentation, and it really is just looking at research in a slightly different way. So I'm from Detroit, and so this next part is going to seem kind of strange. I can almost guarantee it. But, it's like, why are we important? Why does it matter if we're at the table? That is a car that was built in 1926. And in 1926, GM hired somebody from Hollywood to look at how cars were designed. Because the people were like, well, that's not a great car. That's the car I learned how to drive in. And the product designers were actually paying attention to moms. That car is targeting moms. And it's a great car for groceries. You could stick the dog in the back. And I remember my siblings and I laying around in the back and driving for 5 hours to go visit grandparents. But they were listening. Now you look at now, and oh my gosh, I wish I had had that car when my kids were little, right? They have cup holders. They have entertainment stations. So the car companies are really listening. And one of the things that they figured out is that if you have the right car, you can turn from Chevy Chase and Clark Griswold into Batman, right? So it matters, they have really figured out how to make cars important to us in a way. And we haven't figured out how to make clinical research important to patients in the same way that they have. So what made them able to do that? I asked a business guy, a business professor, well, what's important, new product innovation and, all of this. And he said, you need to read this. So I read that. And the point that I think is the most important is the voice of the customer, right? The car companies paid attention to the voice of the customer. So if you buy a car in China, the cup holders are square because they have square boxes in China. They don't have round cups, which I was amazed at. So now you think about clinical research, clinical studies, and who is our customer? Okay, this is from a National Health Council study. They actually went out and said to people, you just had a doctor appointment. How much did you understand? Most people didn't understand very much, right? So that's our customer. That's the people that we're engaging in clinical research, even in, depending on, never mind. But, it's hard for that person to pay attention to the details that matter to them. So who's going to tell that person, how's that person going to be taken care of in a research study? And that's the reason we have research advocates. We act as a patient surrogate, right, in the research development process and the implementation and dissemination. And I think that that's the part that once I can get researchers, a lot of my life is spent convincing researchers to involve people like me in research. And once I can get them to get that, they have an aha moment, and it works. So this is from an article. It's actually, the lead author is on the PCORI Patient Engagement Council. I didn't realize that, Jane Perlmutter. Why involve advocates? And so it does. It adds a sense of urgency. And you are focused on patients if you have advocates on the committee. We changed the tone of the discussion just by being in the room. We have we add a different perspective, not always a diverse perspective, and we're working on that. And I'm not afraid to ask the stupid questions. And I can't tell you how many times, and this is a shared experience, someone like me will walk out of a room and a researcher will come up and say, I'm so glad you asked that, because that's what I wanted to find out. And here's the final benefit, and this is huge, and I don't think academic centers understand this. If you teach me, I teach 20 other people. Public support of science in this country is not as strong as I wish it was. And I think the more that academic institutions work with the public to teach us more, I think you'd see a lot fewer traumas around the NIH budget and the PCORI budget and any kind of healthcare-related budget. So I wanted to give an example of something where we actually had an impact. This is a brochure for a clinical trial that was not accruing very well. And it says at the top, MRI of the contralateral breast. How many people know what a contralateral breast is, right? And this was the consumer information for the trial. And so the advocates who are on that committee said, maybe we should change the brochure. And it was changed to, are you a breast cancer with concerns about your healthy breast? A breast cancer patient with concerns about your healthy breast. And I think that's just kind of, it's an easy example, but it shows the attention to what are you going to think about it versus the doctors are thinking we got to get this done. And I have another example. The MATCH trial is a precision oncology trial that basically it tests patients' tumors and then assigns patients. The patient gets his or her tumor tested, it gets shipped off, shipped back, and then you're assigned to a drug on the trial based on the mutation status of your tumor. So it's very personalized. It's not based on body part, it's based on what your tumor looks like. And the initial design, they said, oh, well, if you're a patient and you're on this trial and you're responding to treatment, then we're going to take you off treatment to see if it was a placebo effect. And the advocates on the committee said, no, that, we were pretty clear that that was not a good idea. And that got changed. There was another, oh, okay, I answered that. So yeah, we conducted a survey. Oh, I should look at my slides before I click. Okay. So I've talked about that. So they listened. We did something that said it wasn't just our opinion, that there are other people that would be concerned about that. And they listened, which was very smart. And another thing with this trial was that the initial biopsy timeline was 3 to 4 weeks. So that means you're a cancer patient. You just got told that your cancer has come back and is growing. And they're going to take a tumor sample, and it's going to take 3 to 4 weeks to get the information back. And the advocates said, that's too long. People aren't going to be willing to wait. I mean, think about it if you put in those shoes. So we did a survey, and it was an amazing survey because the survey expert at NCI said she'd never seen survey results that were this positive, that said, no, that won't work. You have to do it in 2 weeks. And so the end result was the biopsy timeline was pared down to 2 weeks. And the MATCH trial was launched last July. It was supposed to accrue 2 to 3 patients a week. By October, it had accrued 800 patients, and they had to shut it down to do an interim analysis. But the response was so huge to this trial from oncologists and from patients, and it just reopened with about double the arms. And I think that the changes that the advocates weighed in on made a big difference. And the critical piece is that we're part of a team. You know, we're not like over at the side. We're part of the integral conversations. So where do we serve? NCI has a ton of committees. The National Clinical Trial Network, the grant review panels, DOD, CPRIT, PCORI projects. And I really want to applaud PCORI for having a hard line about this stuff, because I can't tell you how often in the beginning we'd get an email or a phone call the night before the grant was submitted and saying, by the way, we want you to be the partner and we need a letter of support in the morning. And our response is, that's not how we work. And PCORI has let us say that. So I do want to talk a little bit about the reality of being a research advocate. That's the research community. Okay, so you all have admin support, you all have tech support, you know each other's voices, and you've met at meetings, so you know what it, you have like a personal relationship there. And then I call in, right? It's get smart. And so it's really challenging, because the researchers have put 20 plus years into earning their seat at that table, and they've gone to school for a long time. They've done boatloads of extra work. I'm there because my mother-in-law got sick and other reasons, but that's basically what flipped me into that. It's hard for them to understand the value that we bring to the table. And I have to say that as much as they have learned from me, I have learned much more from participating as a research advocate on committees than I've taught, because I can't even tell you the beginning or end of the things I've learned about research. So effective advocate engagement, right? Here are the key things that I've learned, and it was amazing. I read the whole 35-page report, and it was great. It was 35 pages. I didn't think you missed anything in that report. I was incredibly impressed by it. You have to have clear expectations, to say, well, we just want you to come to a meeting and participate with us. It's like, that's too scary for everybody. So what do you need from people? There's got to be careful selection. There are people who are great research advocates. There are people who are terrible research advocates. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. And so when we do our training, our RATS training, one of the things we do, we teach, but we also observe. So one of our advocates, she's great. She kind of randomly switches into her yoga moves. So you'll be standing there having a conversation with her. All of a sudden, she goes into downward dog. And I'm not kidding. I mean, and she's really good on phone calls, but face-to-face, it's a little disconcerting. She did this, I'm not kidding, she did this at a training we did on site at a company in California, and they were confused. But so it's just that ability, and the ability to have some distance between your diagnosis or your loved one's diagnosis, so that it's not just personal, so that you can. The worst thing I ever heard was on a phone call. It was a training for FDA, and one of the people on the call kept asking about her medical condition. And that's a great way to marginalize yourself immediately. It's got to be about the collective, not about yourself. You need a basic understanding of science and the research process, and that was nice to see in that report, because I've had researchers say to me, well, I'm tired of professional patients. I just want a real patient. And I feel like saying, I'm tired of professional researchers. I just want a real researcher. I mean, it's like, really? You want somebody in this conversation who doesn't have the ability to have a real conversation with you about endpoints, about interventions, about retention plan? If you want somebody to engage, you have to give them the skills to engage. And so that's the other thing that our RATS training does, is we do Research 101, Cancer 101, Biostatistics 101. And we do it over and over again because if you're a researcher, you swim in these waters every single day. I do it once, well, I'm obsessive, but it took me a couple years just to get the acronyms. And so for someone to be effective, they need to be able to process that language, and it's a very different language. You've got to have great group skills because quite frequently the questions that you ask are going to raise, you may not even realize it, but you can hit a hot button really easily. Like, well, why do you think people would accrue to that trial? Or why do you think people would be interested in that trial? I thought that that was a great question to ask. And I was on the phone call where someone asked it, and the researcher just went off, right? And the advocate was like, well, you know, I wasn't trying to be insulting. I was just curious as to your thought process. So it's one of those things where understanding, you know, having a mutual level of respect and understanding and the ability to listen, because you have to be able to listen and learn from them as much as they do from you. And the last thing is the mentoring and training. How many people in here are doctors, like physicians, MDs? Okay, I bet when you learned how to be a doctor, you watched other doctors do it, right? Okay, so the first time you treated a patient, it wasn't the first time you ever saw a patient, right? So research advocates need to be able to watch other research advocates do it before they get tossed into the lake. It's terrifying otherwise. I mean, I train people, mentor people. One of the things I did was I sat on a committee for an extra year so I could help the new advocates learn, you know, feel comfortable. And we would text back and forth during the call. And the number one question they had was, who is talking now, right? Because they don't know the voices. And so, and as a result of that interaction, now the researchers are asked to identify themselves before they talk. So it's kind of a feedback learning loop. So those are all critical, and we try to cover those in our RATS training. We do our RATS trainings in a couple different ways. Companies love this. I don't know why, but we've gotten funding to do it. We've done it at Lilly and at Genentech. Well, and they bring you in and they kind of want you to drink their Kool-Aid. And then you go out in the bus at the end of the day and say, okay, now here's this part. We've done it at academic centers, and they kind of want you to drink their flavor of Kool-Aid, but it's a different flavor. And the thing that we've done at academic centers is we've assigned mentors. We always try to have some on-site advocates and some non-on-site advocates. So where we've assigned advocates a research mentor afterwards, that has had some really unexpected benefits. So there's an R01 research proposal that went into NCI 2 weeks ago as a result of the advocate-mentor relationship, and a couple of PCORI projects have been spawned out of that, which is just, it's so cool. I never thought that would happen. So now talking about the future. Here's my list of challenges. It's that perception of value. Do we add value? Because in the current funding environment, if we can't prove that we add value, we're the first thing that's going to get cut. And it's interesting to me. I saw a statistic about 5 years ago. NCI had looked back at its phase 3 trials and found that 25% of the phase 3 trials that they had launched through the cooperative groups failed because they were asking a research question that the researchers thought was boring, so failed to accrue. 25%, that's 1 in 4, and that's a lot of money. And I'm like, well, why don't we do feasibility testing before you launch trial to see if it's actually really feasible? They're starting to think that way. Some of the researchers, I'm not the only one, there are a bunch of advocates, a bunch of researchers that are starting to look at things like that, but they're not the things that are funded historically in the grant mechanisms, and changing grant mechanisms is very hard. The other thing is that the research system, I think, in this country is broken. There are some things around human subject protection that are broken, I mean, just the fact that I have to say that phrase says that there's a problem there. The way we do IRBs, the amount of crazy bureaucracy that doesn't add anything to the clinical research, but takes money and time and energy. I mean, that to me is the biggest challenge that we have to face. And so I'm going to close with another one of my heroes. I think Joe Biden, who's been given the job of the cancer moonshot by President Obama, I think he has a shot at actually changing this stuff because he gets it. That's him speaking at a big cancer conference in June. And he actually said, I don't understand why Harvard, Dana-Farber, Sloan Kettering, and Hopkins are all doing the same thing and not sharing their data. I'm like, whoa. I mean, I can say that. Nobody pays attention. When he says it, people are starting to pay attention, and I think that I want to believe that that will have an impact on some of the really critical things that I think are getting in the way of the clinical progress that we should be seeing in research. Having said that, I just want to say thank you, and thank you to everybody who's helped me. I've learned things today, so thank you, all of you.
So I asked, prior to the conference today, I asked for 3 people to give some reflections before we jump into the general group discussion, which I know I have some questions, but I'm going to table those. So I'm going to pick on Shannon first to have her provide her perspective, given that you have a wealth of experience in being a research advocate and training, what your thoughts are and what else you would add based on the great presentation we just heard.
Well, is it on? I actually had a question for Nancy, but it sort of has to do with looking at models that are successful. And I, too, have been involved with the DoD model and with the ovarian portion. And what I found, I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on why that model is so successful. For me, what was amazing about it is the mentor program for that. Prior to meeting, the mentor is your buddy. You are connected to that mentor. Any questions you have about just basic, how's this going to be when I go in? I'm really mixed up about this issue that I'm reviewing, and that person was like there to support me all along the way. And then by the time I got there, I just felt like, yeah, I'm pretty solid about this stuff. I kind of know what's going on. And then the attitude of the researchers in the group was just completely collegial. I felt totally comfortable talking about issues that I shouldn't have. And so for me, it was, an attitude that did permeate the room, plus the mentor that I had beforehand. But I think you've had more, although I think they have a 3-year cap now for that program. But I just wondered if you could comment on the success of that program and what you think made it so successful.
The DoD personnel have drunk that Kool-Aid, and they believe passionately in engaging advocates and engaging the right advocates. They have a fairly rigorous review application process, and they interview people. And it's really important because DoD, for people who don't know, most of the DoD research is preclinical. So imagine, I suspect many people in this room would have a hard time deciphering a preclinical application and figuring out, well, is it novel? How do you do that? And as an advocate, putting those first words down is terrifying. So having somebody that you can call and say, how do I say this and not sound like an idiot, is incredibly important. And the funder requires it. DoD requires it.
So now I'm going to call on Clarissa, who's a researcher, to give her perspective on Nancy's comments.
All right, thank you. So I had several kind of reactions, and then I'll stop with the question. One is just to reinforce in terms of our experience how the challenges you brought up in terms of integrating and effectively engaging patients, and I think you're right on, and making sure that this is the point of this workshop, is to share our learnings and continue to have conversations about how we met those challenges. And I'll give a plug for my patient co-investigators who wrote a little commentary in Permanente Journal talking about some of the lessons we learned as well. The other thing that came up for me is you brought up some very interesting and kind of complicated issues around what I think of as objectivity and advocacy, and not just, I mean, there was the traditional, we think of ourselves as researchers being objective, although, I've come from a qualitative tradition which critiques that, and we worry about, I think, bringing in advocates and what that will do. But there's also, I think, a sense that we as researchers really are advocates as well, and we don't recognize it. So really, I think the opportunity this brings to really highlight that those contradictions and that interesting interplay in research between being objective and being an advocate for something, I think it gets highlighted when you bring patients in a lot of different ways, and I think that's a very positive thing. And so I wanted to kind of raise that up as maybe kind of continuing discussion about this kind of interplay between objectivity and advocacy. And then the last thing was your car metaphor, which, we actually engaged a bunch of patients in using lean processes. So going and looking at other industries, I think, is really important. The lessons learned from other industries about how you engage consumers or the stakeholders and trying to learn from those techniques. And then my last question is, for the future, I mean, what is your ideal, what would you like every patient who's brought into research to have under their belt, or what kind of training, what are the core essentials of the training you'd want them to have as they came into research?
Boy, I'd want them to have a mentor who can walk them through, because just having somebody to talk to and say, I don't understand that, makes a huge difference. To translate, to sit through, what I do at conferences when we have our training there is I go around to posters with people and I say, okay, here's how you look at a poster. And it takes a couple posters, but once they've done it and once they've seen how it's done, then they start doing it their way, which is always amazing. I mean, I love that. And they'll come back and I say, well, I don't think you do it right. And I'm like, that's great. But it takes that initial confidence building of having somebody there to help them, which is really hard. And actually, I'm wildly optimistic. I would love to have a society where, people actually don't get sick. So, okay, I know, that's like totally.
We said big, audacious goals when we started, right? So one thing I didn't mention when we did the initial interviews, we really focused on the Northwest region to learn from the experiences so that we could learn from people who were directly involved in patient and researcher collaborations, but also help build our network in the Northwest region. We were fortunate to also have some colleagues here from the East Coast, from the left coast or the other coast. I always forget the different ways people refer to it. And so I asked Gail to also give her comments as being a patient involved as a partner in another part of the world. Your reflections on this and some of the takeaways you have or reflections based on Nancy's comments.
Well, one of the things that I liked was the fact that when you're at the table, you go to the table as colleagues. And like you stated about the intimidation factor when you're brand new and they already have their connection and you're there. But I'm grateful for the fact that the team that I've been blessed to work with made me feel comfortable. So that meant a lot. And I like the fact that you also stated about what advocates are not. You don't lobby. You don't, look at your individual. It's not about you. It's about the collective being and different experiences that you can become, like you said, you become the patient surrogate, so you're able to explain to the researchers, the different things that they're going through, but you're able to take that same information that the researchers give you and you can go back to the patient and explain it to them better, like you said, the layman perspective. So that really resonated with me when you said that too. And I really think the part about mentoring is the key right there, because if you have somebody that's been doing it, it helps. You don't want to reinvent the wheel and have somebody start off and, so if you can come in and help them and inspire them, then they can take it to the next level. So I think that was great. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
So I want to expand it now to questions from the audience. And one of the, I will start to get the next hand raised so Sarah can get there with a microphone. But one of the things I thought was interesting in talking with people is that we had these 4 different perspectives from researchers and patients. And they're from the researcher perspective, we heard both extremes, that it's great to have somebody who has formal training, who can speak the language that we can really bring to the table, and we have some sense of a level playing field, even though I work with a lot of statisticians and I'm constantly confused, admittedly. From the researcher perspective, we also heard, I don't want somebody who knows any acronyms, right? That I just want that fresh perspective, because once they start to learn about research, they know too much. Like they've unearthed some new things that changes their perspective. From patients, we heard something similar, right? We heard some patients who said, I am most effective when I can contribute to a conversation. I know what the basic context is, that it helps me provide more meaningful content. And then I also heard from patients, we have enough going on. I don't need a PhD. I didn't want to get a PhD. What I want to bring to the table is what the concerns are, the needs are for my community, and let the researchers do the research. So we have 4 somewhat opposing perspectives, and I'm curious what your thoughts are about that, and how does that influence what that means for engaged research?
And that's really interesting. The challenge, the thing that I've seen in my world, which is mostly cancer, but it has done other disease states, is that as soon as it becomes about you, you're not a colleague anymore. You're the patient at the table. And I don't want to be, that's never been the goal, because it's not about me being the patient at the table, it's about me being part of the team. The effective advocates, the people I know and have worked with who are really effective, are effective because they can operate on an equal playing field. If a researcher wants to have the authentic patient experience, that's fine. Do a focus group and get more than one. I'm not sure that authentic patient perspective can really impact a discussion that has to do with endpoints and timelines. And and that's why the comment about the professional patients really torqued me, because it's like, I work very hard. I know we're all patients in some way, shape, or form. I work very hard to know what I know. And for somebody who doesn't do that to say, well, I'm a patient too, and I can do what you do, it's like, no, actually you can't, So I have a bias on that, because I've seen advocates in a lot of situations get marginalized, and it's usually because they don't bring that collective perspective to the table. They bring their story, and that is not always valued, at least in the qualitative research environments that I've been in. It is more valued in the it's more valued in the qualitative. It's not valued that I can see in the quantitative.
So I'm going to follow up with Shannon is also a lawyer, and I'd like permission to lead the witness. So I want to reflect that back. So do you, in listening to what you said, what I took away from it, which could be wrong, so correct me if I am, that to be a research partner has a different meaning than to just inform research. And I don't mean just inform research, but to play a different role in terms of having input into research.
Yeah, if you're a research partner, if you're a partner, that means your voice is equal weight with everybody at the table, which means that you really have to be able to have a conversation. I would hate for a researcher to have to figure out what he or she thinks I mean by reflecting on when I talk about my personal experience. I think it's important to be able to use a common language. And I'm probably not articulating this very well, but I do think, I don't like being tokenized. And when it's about, that, oh, there's our cute little patient advocate, I see that all the time. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about equal partner. So I got a great compliment recently. I went off a committee I'd been on for 10 years. And somebody said, well, it'll be a lot easier with you gone because the people won't be asking the hard questions. I said, no, actually, I trained them, and they will be. But that was a nice compliment. And it's not that, they listened to me. They didn't always agree with me. But I was an equal part of the conversation. And I finally convinced them after a year that it was grossly unfair to have 20 researchers and 1 advocate on 1 committee. So now they have 20 researchers and 2 advocates.
So, question over here, and I'm going to make you hold up your hand until you get a microphone. Otherwise, Sarah will yell at me.
I had one more reflection. I really appreciate your comments about being a partner on a research team and what that entails. And I'm just thinking in terms of, we did this in our project a little bit kind of unintentionally, is that there are so many different ways to engage patients, and thinking really clearly through that. I mean, maybe that's part of what we can do here, is think really clearly through those different kind of levels of engagement or kind of intersections. So like we had the patient who came in and helped us with the co-design through using lean processes, and we gave them some orientation, but they didn't need to be research experts. They just needed to engage in this lean process with us. And then you're talking about focus groups, and that's, pure experience. So just really thinking through all the different ways and how much training a patient needs in different ways of engaging might be really helpful.
And the public health world has amazing examples of how that's done, especially in dissemination.
So I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the bilateral learning involved in the partnership, that it's on both sides are learning from each other. But one thing I did have a question about, and it's just my own curiosity, is on these committees, when are all these meetings taking place? So are they all during what would be kind of their normal business hours, and the participant or patient advocate is having to make concessions so that it might not be during their normal business hours? I'm just kind of curious because I know that happens a lot for us, is that making concessions that the advocates can actually be there at times that are outside of 9 to 5, that normal people who are working in academia want to kind of participate.
There's a reason that an awful lot of people in advocacy are older white women, because we tend to have the ability to not be working full-time at a job, and our demographic does not fit the demographic of the patient at all. No, these meetings are 9 to 5. If I suggest a weekend call, oh my God, they don't work on weekends. Because for me, it's a volunteer activity. It's their work, and I respect that too, because I work with people who work their buns off every day of the week, and I know that they need their personal boundaries too. It's interesting though, because we're involved with a few different PCORI grants, and those meetings are pretty routinely 9 to 5. I hadn't thought about that.
So we have a question here, and then Teresa has her hand up as well. You're first, Janice.
Hi, my name is Janice, and talking about the future, I'm a research patient co-investigator on the LINC team, and I looked at it as being that I'm an ethnographer, that I went into this research team and I learned everything firsthand, and it was a whole new list of acronyms, whatever. And I've heard multiple times that we want new people at every for each research projects because they're professional, but there is definitely a role for us that understand this terminology. And I'm a PCORI ambassador, and through there I've had multiple opportunities to provide input and be present anywhere from the American College of Physicians to the Health Data Palooza to NIAM. I took Cochrane training, and I've met some of the leaders that are out there right now, but I've been able to talk at a minimal, but I understand what they're saying, and they understand what I'm saying. And when this happens, they understand that patients who don't have an education in research are able to contribute and able to learn and give back feedback. So there is something for us. We're natural advocates for the next generation. So it's really important that we do talk to people, and talking to lay people like friends about it. They're like, exactly what you said. Oh, I can do that. And for me, if I bring it up and people will be, why, hey, can't you get them involved? Everybody wants to be involved, and it's very hard to explain how I got. There was many, 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 many years of work that I did on my own that brought me I knew a lot of resources that brought me to the table to begin with. So anyway, I would like to see a lot more lower income individuals involved, and this is something I see that is not made avail, is especially if you want to have something on a national level, they need to have their travel paid for up front, because most of it's reimbursement, and that is a huge, I mean, you're cutting a whole population out there, addressing social determinants of health. We're just talking if we're not doing it.
Yep. No, well, you're exactly right. And we've tried a lot of different models. People have, what we've found with our disease state is that we attract patients. And until patients feel okay about where they are, they don't have the bandwidth to do anything else. So they have to not be in a fragile state of mind, a fragile physical state, or a fragile financial state. And that, they have to have a stable life. And it's really hard if you're low income, you don't have much extra bandwidth. So how do you bring that? The comment about the or the dialysis and patients who are at end of life, yeah. Those are the people we need to watch out for. It's not the healthy patients.
I'd wanted to ask about compensation, and then you mentioned volunteering. And so in terms of thinking, I appreciate your comments about mentoring, and that's really valuable information. And if you think of all that goes into mentoring someone, being the mentee, getting the expertise, getting the collective understanding of what's going on for that patient population, that's a lot of time and commitment. So sustainability is important. So with all of that in mind, what would you recommend as far as compensation? Or monetary, but also other benefits that advocates?
This is why advocacy organizations are important, because they have staff people. And as volunteers, I am a volunteer. I love being a volunteer. Volunteers are inherently flaky at times because it's not their day job. Paid staff don't have that luxury. And so engaging with an advocacy organization allows a certain level of expectation about performance. So when we engage on a PCORI grant, we involve our advocates, but we also say you've got to pay for staff time, because they need to keep up with what's going on. And when, not if, the advocate can't do something, the staff is going to step up and be able to do it. And that can be challenging sometimes. That it's challenging for staff to keep up because everybody's juggling. And it can be hard to, last minute stuff, things come up. I mean, if you're a mom and your kid's sick, that takes priority over a volunteer activity. When we train advocates, we pay all travel expenses. We try to prepay for exactly the reasons that were mentioned. And we try to do group meals so that our secretary doesn't go insane doing the receipts. I occasionally get offered to compensate, but I feel like it puts me in a conflict of interest, and I have the luxury of saying that. I do think that when you talk about getting people who don't have the luxury of turning down money, if you want them involved, you've got to be willing to pay for their time. They don't have it, they may not have it to give. So that's a long-winded way of saying it's not an easy answer, and I think you have to think that through. Wait, get the microphone or we'll get yelled at. She looked like she had something to add to that.
I was just thinking about the fact that, once we learn the different terminologies and the science behind different things, in this day and age with the social media, we can disseminate that information out to a broader aspect. So that goes back to that collective perspective. We're learning and we're giving out to a bigger picture. Again, not focusing on the disease, our disease or our issues again, but getting that information out there and how important that is. And I think once, being a volunteer and being of a lower income and not able to do, certain things, but to have an agency that's able to pay, like you said, put the money out there and do that. So it helps you get more experience. It helps you with the mentorship because you become connected to other people who are doing it. And so that helps out too. And just the knowledge that you learn and the fact that you're going to impact somebody and it's going to impact future research, future cures or whatever is a big plus in becoming an advocate.
Yeah, and I do think, the issue around compensation is really very real, and I don't know. So DoD pays an hourly rate when you do grant review, which is great because it takes an arm and a leg load of time. NIH pays something like $200 a day if you're going to a meeting. So you spend a day flying there, a day there, and you make $200, which actually comes out to like $158 after taxes. And so, the system is not set up to succeed for low-income people. And I honestly don't know. That's really interesting. I'll have to think about that.
Something interesting that we also have to consider too is that it may affect their benefits. So if they do accept an honorarium, whatever disability benefits or other things that they're receiving can be impacted. So we have to be really cognizant.
Yeah.
Hi, I had just kind of a reaction, and I think it's to some of what you were speaking to in terms of the power and wanting people to not be marginalized. And I come at this as a researcher, and I have a PCORI grant, but also as someone who's done rehabilitation research where I've worked with disability communities. And for years, we've worked hard to not use the term patient. We've worked hard to have them be people or individuals first. And we call that person first language. And so it's been interesting in the PCORI process. I don't know that I've ever given this feedback to PCORI, and I should, but it's been an adjustment in my head about what the language we use, which I think came up earlier, and how I guess when we've talked to our stakeholders about it, they prefer not to use the word patient. We just call them partners. But I just wondered what thoughts you have about just our terminology around that, because I worry that when we use the word patient, still we're marginalizing people, but I don't know that that's every group's experience.
I think it was interesting to me to listen in on or to participate in the NCI working group that came up with the term research advocate, because it was the lay people who did not want the word patient in the term, because I do think that for a lot of patients, they feel, they're more than a patient, and they didn't want to be marginalized to that. Having said that, I want to say that PCORI has done more to do for everything. I agree with what you said. At the same time, they have legitimized the term patient in a way that I've never seen legitimized before, and it's because they're a funder and they require it. And I keep coming back to that. If NIH, one of my missions in life is to get NIH to have the same requirement. We'll see.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. And I find myself switching languages depending on who I'm talking with. But
Yeah.
I want to add to that in terms of when you serve as the patient partner on a team, you are automatically disclosing something personal about your healthcare that I don't think is always known up front when you're saying, hey, will you be this patient partner? That then implies to the rest of the world, anything we disseminate, you may be referred to as our patient partner. And this came to me through a couple of different venues, but it also came to me from a gentleman who's doing research, and he said, this whole idea of patient partnership, he's like, I would love to have that input, but I do research in erectile dysfunction. I don't have men knocking down the door to be my patient partner, because that ultimately reveals something about them that they may not want to share with everybody else. So how do I get to that? So in thinking about different populations,
You involve the spouses.
but I think that gets to, and I want this perspective. How do I match the input that I need with finding the right people? And I think that's something that can be a challenge to come by. Nate, did you have something? Yeah. Hold on, you have to wait for the. Sure. Wait for it.
There it is. Can you hear me? Okay. I just want to say thank you for being an advocate and for really emphasizing how important it is to be showing the strength of that type of role. And I think there's a lot of benefit in helping be able to help communicate the strength of having that level of trust that's gained through being in that role and being an extension to the community in a really tangible way for when we talk about funding at risk and what true outcomes can come from having these partnerships. That's a really important point to me, is to say you're an extension to help translate research to the community and to gain trust by having that peer-to-peer relationship. You're talking about items like when you have a fourth of clinical trials failing because you haven't done any usability testing. You know, those things to me are really important to kind of take in as how we represent this work. And it's something that I know for our network, when we talk about measurement, we talk about process measurements and we talk about outcome measurements and we talk about attendance and we talk about what our demographics are of patient partnerships. And then we also talk about how has research been impacted by that guidance. But I think this is extending it even further to say on the national level, this is the kind of work that can uplift those changes. So I just want to commend you for that and also say that it's helpful for us as we develop things like PCORI toolkits and other ways to really help communicate about this work and help educate bidirectionally for clinicians and others in that work to see the value from both ends of it. I think it's really important to make those considerations.
Yeah, yes, to everything.
To me, it was helpful to emphasize that because it helps the way I think about the work as well, being in a role of helping to kind of advocate as an engagement coordinator for our own network. And we work with a lot of clinics that do serve Medicare and Medicaid, uninsured populations. So these questions about compensation, we've also had to communicate and work with, and we try and build equitable relationships based on what those who are in that position want from us in terms of being supported. And I think there's tangible ways to compensate in terms of financial means, and there's also ways of compensating through training and opportunities to be able to go to conferences and to enrich that experience themselves through things that may not end up as a tax reportable, way to support. So those things are really helpful to think through as well.
Well, and people, what I found is that, people really want to give back. Most of the time, most people are genuinely nice. And so, for example, one of the things, we were talking about accrual at a meeting. I go to a lot of meetings. And I said, well, why don't we put up posters in waiting rooms to see if, talk to your doctor about a clinical trial. And I said, we could cluster randomize. We could do it at all the hospitals in Cleveland and none of the hospitals in Detroit or something like that and see if it changed accrual rates. And what I was told is there was no data to show that that was an effective intervention. I'm like, well, actually marketing works. There's a lot of data to show that. But it's just thinking about it a little bit differently. And I think that extending the science out into the community is really critical for our world.
So I have a question for you. One of the things that I have found, one of many things I have found very valuable in working with Mary is her ability to write concisely and help me with my long-winded writing. I think it's an extension of not only the perspective that she brings as someone with a condition and a perspective as somebody who's thinking about what the voice of the patient should be, but also these extra skills that she brings to the table from her professional and experience. How do you handle that in training in terms of recognizing that people are more than just their patient or caregiver or care partner experience, but they may also bring something professional? At what point do they reveal that hand, or how does that get integrated, if at all, into their work as advocates?
It really depends on the role that they're serving. So if we put somebody on a DoD grant review team, or if we nominate them, we need to know that they can not be intimidated by basic science and that they can write clearly. So we look for writing skills, and we ask people to, like you have to write a blog a year. So I don't remember what all the details are, but we look at people and we say, okay, well, this person might need some help here, and so how are we going to do that? So we partner people up so that they're working together with someone. I hope she tells you to kill adverbs, because the academic folk I work with, they have way too long sentences and they use way too many adverbs in them. The skills that are really interesting are financial skills. So I've seen business people come onto committees and say, well, what's the ROI of that, of doing that? And the researchers are like, well, what does ROI stand for? I mean, they know now, most of them know it's return on investment, but they've never looked at it that way. So it's a really personal thing of the level of comfort in the room. Because to do that kind of personal thing, you have to feel like you're a valued part. You have to have the skills to recognize that contribution would actually be valuable.
Are there other questions? Mary, you had a question.
I was really interested in your comments about the importance of mentoring. And I hadn't really thought about that in the work that I've been doing with Danielle. But it seems like I don't represent any group. I'm not associated or affiliated with any advocacy organization. I can see that mentoring would be very important when you're dealing with an advocacy organization. But what I've been wondering about is for the role of patients like myself who come on just out of happenstance, almost for a project. And then what do you see as the future for involvement in an ongoing basis of patients like myself? Because when these projects run out, if there's nobody who's approached me, I guess I'll say, to be involved on another one, well, then the skills that I've used here and the things that I've learned are essentially, been important, but limited. So that's one question I had, or observation.
Well, okay, let me answer that, because I won't remember two questions in a row. So the thing that we found is that people want to do a lot more work than there is work to do. So we do a lot to help people engage. We send out articles and say, can somebody please write a lay summary of this? Or can 3 of you do that? And so that's another tool that we use because the first thing that we have to do is teach people it's okay to talk. So my advice to somebody who wants to stay involved is to talk to Danielle and say, this project's almost over. I'm having separation anxiety. I really want to stay involved in some way, shape, or form. Because it is a really meaningful role to play. And I have to say, you are a rare and wonderful bird. I wish there were more people like you out there who could do this and feel comfortable at it just by being you. That's wonderful.
One other thing while I've got the microphone, and then I'll quit, is it seems to me that we need to kind of broaden the base of representatives of both the research and the patient communities. I think we're really missing out on, I think if we look towards the future, we need to get people who are in medical schools, who are directing curriculum for medical schools and for nursing schools and for all of those kinds of activities, so that this next generation of caretakers, if you want to call it that, or clinicians, will be grounded immediately in their thoughts of patient involvement. And I don't see that we're doing a lot of that at this point, but then I don't know, but I just...
I think it depends on the field. Cancer tends to have a lot of loud advocacy groups, so I think we're probably a little further ahead than other health fields. There are a couple of clinical research training courses for beginning researchers, and they all involve patient advocates as part of it, and the researchers are required to work with the advocates. But it's happenstance. It's not a regular part of a medical school. I mean, I do wish that academic institutions had as a core mission to advance their science out into the community in some way.
I was just going to add to what she had mentioned, Mary had mentioned, that opportunities. So there are opportunities if your voice is out there and if you like express it to your PI, because they need peer support. They'd like to have people reading articles, giving patient feedback on articles, for peer review, especially if there's a patient on there, there's opportunities for that. Guidelines, Consumers United Evidence, if you're with an advocacy group, is always looking for more groups. And through there, you help provide input, you read articles. But there's easy training for it, and there is opportunities to travel and to participate at a national level. And once your name is like in the hat, just like what happened to you, you'll be asked to be doing different things. There's technical expert panels. It's small compensation. And regarding what you were mentioning about lower income, I brought that up in our grant. When I read the grant right off the bat, I realized this is going to be a problem, even though it was only a couple $1,000s, but I knew it would directly impact some of the inpatients that were in the design process. So all that needed to be done was to be able to be, to have it paid incrementally and or in other ways, like, you could give a card. There's other things you can do, like a shopping card to Walmart. I mean, there's other alternatives. So, but if it's paid incrementally, then they can do it. And most of them will be willing to do that. They can make a couple $100s a month easy and over time. So, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Nancy before we start into the question right here? Hold on, we're going to do a mic pass off. Just so you know, Sarah doesn't really yell at me. But
Hey everyone, I have a comment, thought, question thing. So I'm trying to think about patient engagement and how do you do patient-centered engagement? And me, I'm not a patient on this panel. I'm a parent of a patient. And I was thinking about why am I here, which was the opening question. And I'm here because I want other kids to not experience what my child experienced and to have better outcomes. And then I was thinking about patient engagement and how do I stay engaged and stay involved? And I wonder if anybody in this room, if this is a common practice, has some sort of provider. If we're research advocates, is there a position where our duties are listed and are they tied back to what it is that we want? Like me as a parent of a child with a disease, I want something different for the world. And so if it were laid out in a position description that if you do these 8 things or try your hardest to do it, then we think you're going to be part of a project that's going to make outcomes better, then that's empowering to me as a parent of, okay, so that's my role, versus being a patient advocate at a meeting who is chiming in occasionally. So I just wonder if this is common practice, because I'm just thinking about this while we're in the room today and how I can do a better job in my group. So that's my question to the group. Is anyone doing that well? Is that...
So my patient co-investigators, that was one of their big feedback, is that they wanted a job description. I mean, this was after the fact. They didn't get one, unfortunately. But but the repercussions were that when my colleague came to me and asked for help with a new PCORI grant, I said, well, you need to make a job description, and I actually involved Michelle and Janice as well, sent her the job description. But it was interesting because she kind of had these bullet points, and I'm like, no, they want a real job description. And so I had to rewrite it for her as a job description, and Michelle and Janice commented on it and gave input. But I think that is important, to have expectations really clear and also be very clear about what you hope the outcome is for the project and why involving different types of stakeholders, what that's going to contribute. And actually, I don't know if Janice and Michelle want to say anything. Because it's your idea.
actually, if you don't mind, I would actually love to hear your perspective on a job description. Because when I write a job description, it sounds probably vastly different than what I've just heard in terms of if you do X, Y, and Z, this is what you're going to get. Mine's going to sound probably very researchy and very like big asks and maybe intimidating. And so I'd be curious when we talk about these, what we think are common topics of a job description, what are the elements that you think we need to include and what's the right framing for it?
Okay, well, thank you for asking it. I came from a working environment into this other environment, and so I was always expecting a job description. This is what I do, and I was struggling. The first several months I was really struggling because I didn't know what I was supposed to do. So I can't come right out and say anything specific about, do this or do that, but some real basic things like attend all science meetings, participate in conference calls, seek out additional training. You must pass training that, I'm part of the Group Health Research Institute, and so must pass the training that the Group Health Research Institute requires of its employees. So some basic things like that, not, write this, do that, do the other thing, but those types of things. Because if I had that in the beginning, then I know, okay, part of my job is to show up to every meeting. Part of my job is to participate. Part of my job is to do this. And then I would get more and more. Part of my job would be pre-meetings. Part of my job would be to be with Janice, my partner in this, for us to meet twice a month to discuss stuff. Those are the types of things that I wanted. And then I would get more and more clear, and I'd feel better rather than just going to a meeting and if I don't say anything, am I going to get paid? I don't know. I think so. But if I know that if I just go to a meeting, I'm going to get paid, that type thing, if that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, that's totally. So I was on a committee, different committee, of advocates who served on NCI research committees, and we developed a role and responsibility document that said, you're expected to show up at the meetings. You're expected to know what the ongoing protocols are. And before we wrote that down, not everybody understood that they needed to know what the ongoing protocols were. You need to be prepared to comment on protocols in development. You need to be prepared to comment on accrual strategies for trials that aren't accruing. And just defining that helped, it made me feel better. And then the other thing that we put in there, because the NCI staff wanted us to, they said, there are a lot of advocates who don't talk. And I said, okay, then we need to put in there, you're expected to speak up. If you're not talking during a meeting, you're not doing your job. You will get about 3 minutes of airtime total in an hour, and it's up to you to figure out where to use it and how to use it.
So just one comment.
But you have to wait for the microphone.
It's super quick.
It doesn't matter. There are rules, and we all must play by them. Now you may speak.
So as researchers, they actually have to provide this in the scope of work in the grant as well as in the budget narrative. So all of that stuff is written somewhere already that really exists and maybe could be expanded on a little bit with some timeframes. But those are all part of what's already available, so it's really sad not to be shared. To me, it's kind of funny now thinking about it. It's that all of that stuff is readily available. And for us, a job description would be, it took us 9 months to get a job description through our system because we're a tribally owned and operated healthcare facility. So that sounds like horrible, but the scope of work and all of that is really, that would be just cutting and pasting and having it readily available for a discussion to say, does this work for you? How does this in kind of actually the writing of the grant as well as after? So I love your description. I actually wrote it down already.
Part of what your comments sparked for me was thinking with as a researcher, thinking with our patient partners about our mission and our vision. And I think a lot of times we're used to kind of thinking in the framework of specific aims and things like that that are very tied to a research grant. But really what what your comments sparked for me is like going beyond this and what's sort of the big picture and what are the gaps that we need to address and why are they important, which may or may not be clear, I think, at times, and understanding from patient perspectives as well, what do they see as the needs in the area so that we can co-craft sort of mission and vision for the work moving forward in a way that's readable by everybody and understandable by everybody, and everybody can be involved in that process. I think that's a great idea, and it's made me think about, we work a lot in our projects with project advisory boards, and the need to make sure we're continually orienting our project to kind of where we are and why we're here. And sometimes things happen and we move along, we're not always clear enough, I think, about sharing what's moved us. Maybe we've gone to a meeting or something and learned something, and we need to make that really clear so that we can be working together.
Yeah, when researchers get inspired, I love it. I mean, their passion, it flows out, and it's usually because they went to a conference or something like that. And it's so cool when it happens, and that happens with advocate partners too. See, now I'm doing it too, advocate partners, patient partners, whatever the right word is.
I was going to say, going back to your point about job descriptions, I think early on we developed a governing structure, and I think we listed some roles and responsibilities, and I think we shared that with everybody on the team, and I'm not sure anybody, including myself, have looked at it since we said this is it, which makes me think I should go back and look at it. But I think that is also a good place in order to put everybody's role and responsibility, including my own as the PI of the project. And then this other point that you made, I really appreciated your presentation because you've articulated a lot of things that I think that we'll share in our models of engagement tomorrow, but I've never said so eloquently. But one of the things you said was, the importance of having more than one patient. We have 2 patient partners on our project, and I always felt early on that it was important for them to have a peer, because even though I was always open to anybody coming to me with questions or anybody on the project team, for them to be able to have each other, to support each other through this process and say, did you get that? I didn't get that. They needed that in order to be successful on the project. And I've helped to structure other people's patient engagement teams and plans, and have said, you need to have 2 people. And then they'll say, well, we can't afford that. And you're like, really? These aren't even people paid at the cap. So I think we're going to be okay probably having 2 people on a patient engagement team.
Well, one of the things that always, in my world, they're afraid if you have 2 people, they'll talk twice as much. So I've had to say, okay, only one of them will talk during the meeting. They'll trade off. I am serious. But it's...
Baffled.
Hey, oncology, what can I, but I think, it's one of those bandwidth things where they need to understand that the people are here to add value to the conversation. The other thing that I've done with people who have separation anxiety when I stop mentoring them is I've set them up with a research mentor on the same project. And I've brokered the conversation and said, now, it's okay if this advocate asks you a really dumb question, and everybody's okay with that. And and I put it out there so that people are comfortable, and I'm really careful to pick researchers that will make the extra effort to explain things at a level and help move the advocate along. And those relationships have gotten very good.
This discussion makes me think we've talked about patient-to-patient mentorship and then a research patient mentorship or a partner mentorship, but we haven't talked about researcher-to-researcher mentorship in terms of what does it mean to involve stakeholders in the work that you do. And I know that I share this experience with others who've been funded by PCORI. You immediately get called of, okay, what am I supposed to be doing here? So I think when we think about that mentorship, it's not something that's formally taught in school.
Yeah.
And so what we don't know is really uncomfortable, so we just don't do it. Or, some people have been really great. There's different models of engagement. I'm going to call out Nate because he holds a unique position in his group of being the patient and stakeholder engagement lead, if you will. So he's not the PI on a project. The PI has designated him to really be the facilitator in thinking through these issues, and I think that that's a really unique model too. So as we think about different models and different mentorship, that was something that we heard through the interviews. It would be great to learn from my peers and what's working, what's not working, and peers, obviously patient to patient, patient to researcher, et cetera. So I think we have to think about we need help too, and how do we frame that up so that we're successful, and also to Mary's point earlier, training the next generation of researchers who are going to come about.
Right. I have a question in follow-up to what Karen said. How many people are on one of these NCI committees?
Well, NCI is a really bad example because they're like 20 to 30 people and, you know, 1 or 2 advocates. And you're expected to be there for that entire disease state and represent. And then the advisory committees are about the same. And these advisory committees are pretty important. They're the ones who make, you know, recommendations that shape what an NCI is going to be doing. And there's usually 30 of the most important researchers in the country at the table, and you have 1 business person and 1 advocate. And that is really, that's scary.
Because they need to be listening to more patients than 1.
Well, no, these are the smartest people in the world, and I mean, but see, that's the reality. I know. And I don't want to downplay what they've done to get there. They've really earned their way to the table, and I'm sure it irks them that somebody like me just gets to trot in after being an advocate for a few years. And I think it shows the responsibility that's on the advocate to understand the context of the discussion and contribute in a knowledgeable, meaningful way to the topics that are being discussed. So when I'm on an advisory committee, I interact very differently than I do on a research review committee. It's not collegial.
Is there any way to make the perception that researchers have of patients more porous, meaning that each researcher has their own personal life, their own experience with cancer, their own child, whoever, whatever. They've all been patients. And yet, once it's in the realm of work and science and research, the patient is an entirely separate category. And we often feel less than for many reasons. So it becomes a top-down. And yet, and it's so mind-boggling to know that all these people, that you're working with, are also have it within them to know and feel and be what it is to be a patient.
So the researchers I work with work harder than most of the people I know. They put in way more than a 40-hour work week. They spend huge amounts of time writing grants and mentoring their youngins to get, you know, so that you do have the next generation. They have to publish and they have to edit articles that their youngins are writing, and they're very focused on what they need to do next to get it done. And if you can catch one of them at the bar after a meeting, it's a totally different conversation. I have huge amounts of respect for the researchers I work with, and I frustrate them, they frustrate me. But we all know that we are looking for the common good, and so there have been multiple times where the funniest one I remember is this beautiful clinical trial was being presented, and I listened to it, and I'm thinking, I really. And so at the end of the presentation, I said, you know, I understand the science that we'll get out of this, but this is a huge phase 3 trial, and at the end of the day, is it going to change how patients are treated? And I was honestly confused, and I was like, I don't understand this. And there was total silence on the phone, and then somebody said, you know, she's right. We shouldn't do it, you know. But it was one of those things. They got wrapped up in the science, which was beautiful. And they just weren't looking at that side, which is totally, completely understandable. I don't see that as much anymore. I see people, I see researchers, you know, what I've seen in my world is that they're getting older and their parents are getting cancer. It's a lot more immediate to them than it was 10 years ago.
So I just have a specific question. You mentioned the training modules that you have your people look over and over and over. Well, part of the study that we've done is to look at everything that's out there and then try to, you know, review it sort of. And we're not at that point yet, but I wondered, did you create your own, or are you using like basic science module or genetics or biostatistics? What are you looking at?
Well, so a lot of them have been self-created. Some of the initial ones, because I think a lot of the stuff out there is pretty didactic and not very helpful to lay people. You know, and when you talk about germline mutation, right there, that phrase is a deal breaker, right? And so you can't do that. So some of it is self-created. I was on another committee with NCI that is looking at what kind of training modules can be developed by NCI or housed by NCI. So there is a lot of material out there. I'm most familiar with the cancer stuff, but I'm happy to share.
I guess as advocates, if you're not given that by your researcher and you want to learn about it, there's a lot of stuff out there, as we saw. So it just seems odd that we have to you had to create new stuff with all that stuff out there. It's just...
Well, it's one of those things where, you know, if you're explaining cancer biology, the researcher will say, blah, 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 oncogene, protogene, da-da-da-da-da. And then we need to stop and say, okay, that's what this means, and here are the takeaways. And that's the step that with science, you know, it's the what does that mean and what's the takeaway? What are the things that you need to remember from this that are missing in some of the trainings that we've done, which again are very specific to cancer. And that's a hard thing. There are a lot of groups looking at trying to do this though.
And is there a best practices that you've created or that you've seen for a research advocate that you...
You know, the problem is that there's not one job description. There's a job description that fits every opportunity. So there's some general stuff, but we have not been at the point where we could even begin to develop something that's not hugely general.
So to that point, this isn't a formal question. You said there's not one job description. There's a lot of great conversation around job description. I wasn't quite sure what the context of that was. Like, is that missing? Is that needed? You have it, you want it. I don't have anything up here about job description, and there's a lot of conversation about it. So I would invite anyone that would like to take a sticky note and offer me that clarity so that I can capture it on the wall, or if someone has some way to synopsis of that conversation around the importance or the need of job description.
So imagine you get invited to a meeting and you know it's about research, and you come to the meeting, you don't know anybody there. Danielle is there and she says, "Hi, I'm so glad you could come." And then people start talking and you have no idea what they're talking about or what you're supposed to do there.
You're describing his day. No.
Yeah.
That was kind of like
Yeah, I know. I think that's...
So in addition then, so related to, I'll use the microphone. These guys, I can feel them looking at the side of my head at that point. So in relating to mentoring and training, that's one way of understanding the job, but then there's a need for a job description, and there's a challenge in that there is no one just job description. It's really different relative to the project.
There need to be, expectations need to be very clearly set at the beginning. So when PCORI calls us, or when a potential project calls us, we're very clear about, okay, what are your expectations? How many meetings? What meetings do you want us? What kind of feedback are you looking for? Are you looking for somebody to attend all the meetings consistently, or somebody to coordinate patient feedback from a large group of patients? What are you looking for? And then as we go through the conversation, we'll frequently say, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And so the expectations will change. But we don't like to get engaged in stuff unless there are clear expectations up front.
Clarifying the expectations for each project kind of makes a single job description challenging. Is that what I'm hearing? Okay. And roles.
Roles, yeah.
And roles.
I have a question that I never hear discussed, and it's about speed. As an advocate, I've moved from one setting to another, and the minute I step into a medical setting, the speed of the communication is tripled or more than that. I remember getting up once when I was supposed to make a talk, and I said, after 3 medical speakers, slow down, because that is what I have found is often a barrier just to the understanding. If you can, you can get the message, but there's very little transition time. And most communications, there is, and I remember once saying, have you finished the topic you were on? And then, are you in a new topic? Because that I think is a real barrier for patient advocates. I don't know if you've experienced that or it's being worked on any place. I'd like to know.
Well, I think the issue is, as Danielle said, that researchers have agendas, right? You have a meeting, you have an agenda. The agenda is usually pretty packed. And so you have to talk really fast in order to get through the agenda before you go to your next meeting. And so that's one of the things that's a problem, is that these meetings get very, very full. You're right, I had never thought about that before, but things do go very fast. In terms of transitions, I mean, I've never taken that one on. I agree completely that the conversations jump around a fair amount, and I just have never tried. When I run meetings, I run them differently. We have very clear transitions, and we take, and I don't overpack them. But I do think that it's hard. And again, people in the research community they are juggling so many responsibilities, especially if they're a clinician and a researcher. The number of things that you're juggling is really amazing to me. So I think it's hard to say you need to slow down.
Well, I think it's very important. I listened to Nate dealing with this with our OCHN committee, where the researchers are communicating. I mean, they come to communicate with the advocates, and nobody says to anybody ever, could you slow that down? Because it really is not comprehensible until you do.
Well, you can try setting expectations with them up front. We do patient webinars, and we always say, please don't do the presentation that you gave at your last grand rounds with all the p-values and all of that. And the only time that didn't happen was when we had the biostatistician talk, because I gave him an outline and I said, this is what I want you to talk about. Otherwise, that's in their bones. They don't think about, hey, we all have our blind spots. That's.
Julie, I think you had a comment. I wanted to piggyback on an earlier comment. It was you. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. To the right of Nate, Lynn. Is it? Lynn. Yeah, Lynn. Okay, and you were talking about sort of researchers use the word porous. I don't know, and I think it was more having a sort of a talking about what I was saying earlier about these classifications, and I don't know that they're doing us the amount of good that. I don't know. I think it oversimplifies who we are as people, and I think it might be more useful to talk about the values that science, the things that science values, the things that a clinician values, the things that a patient values, and having that more values-oriented discussion could kind of clarify those positions and I think make it less these differences less personal, perhaps. So I just appreciated that comment that you made and wanted to add that.
Wanted to add a tidbit of what we did at Group Health to prepare for the meetings. Janice and I would meet sometimes in the lobby and talk, do you understand anything? And then we'd go upstairs and we continue to talk, and what that led to were the pre-meetings before the meeting. And so one of the team members was assigned to Janice and me. And we would meet a half an hour before the science meetings. And first off, we'd go over during the last week, was there anything you did not understand? Let's open it up, let's discuss it. And it was just three of us. It was a staff person and Janice and me. And we discussed the last meeting and then said, now let's prepare for today's meeting. And every single item we talked about. So when we walked into the science meeting, we weren't wasting time by saying, I don't get that, please do this, please do that. We got it ahead of time. And we did that for about 2 years because we committed ourselves to 3 years. So for 2 years, we met each time, and we were added, as it went on, Janice and I were able to add great value because of those pre-meetings. Nothing was a surprise to us then.
Brilliant. That's a great idea. I'm going to take that one home.
I think we have time for one more comment. Not that I'm rushing through the agenda, but I want to make sure that we stick to that first goal, which is networking.
So I just want to add on to that conversation. We talk about being caught by surprise about something there, or it goes too fast. And the other thing that, especially early on our study, is when the first statistics were going up, sometimes I would get caught in my own, where I fit in the data, you know, and you'd see something, you'd like, whoa, I don't like that, you know, and then you're like, okay, I have to drop that for now, and I have to engage back as a whole group of people, not just me, and I have to go home and think about that. But it was those surprises, and sometimes the researchers would start talking, and they can be totally abstract about those numbers that are up there, and if you're a part of those numbers, you can't be so abstract about it. So it just takes a while to learn how to handle that and learn how to say, I can think about that now, or I can think about that later.
So I had said that we had time for one more comment, and it wasn't actually rigged at all, but I think that's the most profound comment to end on, in the sense that, you know, the patient experience is personal, and when we do get in a room and we're looking at data, we have had this ability to depersonalize data, but you know, it's when you're talking about these things, you're talking about moms, dads, sisters, brothers, children, and it has a huge meaning to it. And I think, you know, bringing the close of this meeting on that comment to recognize that is really important. So I appreciate you for that comment and for closing on that. In the last 10 minutes, I'm just going to do kind of a wrap up of where we've been, where we're headed tonight, and where we're headed tomorrow. So I, was thinking about how do we evaluate whether this workshop was good or not. I have a really unhealthy relationship with my phone and my email account, and I haven't thought about it once since I walked in the doors. And so on my evaluation criteria, this has been a fantastic discussion, and I've been totally engaged. I've heard some really great discussion that's going to set us up well tomorrow. We're going to tackle 2 topics. We're going to talk about models of engagement. What are the different ways people have tried? We're going to start it by being grounded in 2 different experiences of how models for patient engagement and stakeholder engagement have been developed. I hope that people share their own experiences, knowing that there's different formats and views of that, but we figured it would be good to start with a group discussion, and then we'll break down into our tables and really talk about where do we need to go to move the field forward. We'll do the same thing around diversity. We're going to bring up 2 speaker groups who've tackled diversity in different ways, and then we'll do the same thing. What else have people tried in their own respective work, and then where do we need to go as a field? We'll spend the latter part of tomorrow really taking all of these great visuals that Makeda has put together and using that to help us chart the path forward.